My name is Laurie Wood, and this is my story. My son Jacob grew up in Knoxville and graduated from CV in 2009. He just recently celebrated his 24th birthday, and I actually feel very fortunate to say that because Jake didn't follow the typical path of a high school graduate. He has spent the past 6 years battling addiction, and I have spent the past 6 years mourning the son that I once knew, or as I knew him. I only have time to share a small glimpse into what 6 years of living with an addict looks like, and the sequences of events may not be accurate because really the timeline becomes very blurred. It's just a vicious circle of lies, theft, homelessness, rehabs, and jail. Just know that in addition to the few major events I'm sharing today, there were countless trips to meetings with public defenders and travel to court hearings between 2 different counties, and many, many visits to my son in jail. The story really begins when Jake was just in 6th grade and he was diagnosed with severe Crohn's disease. It's an autoimmune disease for which there is no cure. He had his first major surgery that year, and it was followed by 6 years of doctors, hospitalizations, trips to the ER, 4-hour infusions, and a lot of medications. And many of those medications were to control pain: Vicodin, Percocet, fentanyl patches. As he would build a tolerance to one drug, the dosage was increased or a more potent drug was prescribed. We were definitely concerned, but not overly alarmed because we knew he needed them to function during his flare-ups of his disease. Jake wasn't a straight-A student, but he did his best to stay involved in school activities. He played junior and senior high school basketball. He joined the drama team one year and had a role in the production of Calamity Jane. So even through his pain and illness, he maintained a good sense of humor and really wanted to be involved. But he became very ill in his senior year, and we drove him to the Cleveland Clinic, and he spent 5 weeks there recovering from his second bowel resection. I knew he had a real problem at this time. He was very reluctant to leave the hospital and the potent pain meds they were giving him there. He was rude to the nurses. They were even a few minutes late with his scheduled meds. He was irate when the doctors started weaning him from those medications. And when the doctors started talking him, sending him home, he would have sudden bouts of severe pain, gaining him yet another night's stay at the hospital. It took a private conversation with his doctors, but we finally got him home. And after a full recovery, the doctors deemed him in remission and pulled all those pain meds from him. This is about the time I met addict Jake. It wasn't long after graduation that Jake began his relationship with the law. He was just still 17 years old and in desperate need of those pain pills that were no longer being prescribed to him. He needed to buy them on the street now. He'd already sold all of his possessions: his cell phone, TV, game system, laptop, all the things a teenager has. So he visited his grandmother, and he stole several blank checks from her, wrote them out for several $100s each, forged her name, and cashed them at local stores. We were all afraid because these were serious felony charges. We convinced him to turn himself in. We actually, my husband, myself, and Jake's grandmother, put him in the car and drove him to the state police barracks, where he did turn himself in. I think because of that, and because he was a minor, and it was obvious that he had support in his family, he was given probation and community service and required to pay fines and restitution. I really thought this was the end of it. He seemed so embarrassed and very remorseful and actually fearful of the whole legal situation. But he continued to use, and it really was just the beginning. He went into 30-day rehabs on 3 different occasions, usually when he was feeling pressure from the law or probation was coming after him for unpaid fines, or he felt threatened by dealers for unpaid debt. or he was simply at a dead end with no means to score the drugs and was dope sick. But the result was always the same. He would relapse and fall into the same routine of doing anything for his poison. I can't honestly remember the reason for his first incarceration at Tioga County Prison, but I will never forget my first visit with him there. I sat in a cinder-blocked room on a metal stool peering through a window, and when a door opened on the other side and my son walked through wearing a prison-issued orange jumpsuit, I lost it. He sat down and punched in his code into the phone, and the phone on my side blinked and I picked it up, but I had no words, just tears. Neither of us ever expected to have a conversation under those circumstances, but unfortunately it wouldn't be the last time. It was after his third stay in one of those 30-day rehabs that he realized he couldn't come back home to the same people, same environment, same old habits. He found placement in a halfway house in York, PA. He was doing really well there in that structured environment. He was going to meetings, he was working, going to church, he had very supportive people around him, found a sponsor. But one day a routine drug test gave a false positive, and the house rules required that he leave the house for 24 hours. My son called us that night from a park bench in the middle of the city in the middle of winter with a backpack and a few of his belongings. No money and nowhere to go. We wired him money for food and lodging for the night, and he did go back the next day and tested negative. But he was so upset with the situation that he'd put everyone in that he decided to leave. This was a life-altering decision for him because it led him to Franco, the dealer, the heroin dealer, and Franco gladly took him in. Jake ran the streets of York for close to a year, using and indirectly dealing heroin. He would call my husband and I and his dad several times a week, begging for money for food, transportation, clothes, or saying he had nowhere to stay and needed a hotel room. The reasons were endless. Between us, we must have sent him thousands of dollars that year. But I finally came to the realization that I was really just buying heroin for my son. So after the money stopped coming, there were times when he would call me saying he hadn't eaten in days and would ask me if I would order a pizza online and have it delivered to a York address. As a mom, I couldn't go to bed knowing that my son was hungry, so I did this on several occasions. But he was so deep into his addiction at that time, and I was so skeptical and untrusting of him that I really wondered if he was trading the pizza for heroin. That's how bad it became. Then one day, his buddy Franco made the mistake of selling to an undercover cop. And all three, Franco the dealer, Steve the driver, and Jake the lookout, were arrested and taken to York County Prison. You can't imagine how I felt the night I got that phone call. I knew Jake was looking at more felony charges for possession and intent to sell, and I was terrified. I knew they wanted Jake to testify against Franco. They wanted the dealer. And I truly felt he was in danger of being in the same jail with that person. This is the only time that I ever bailed my son out of jail. In hindsight, I know that sounds irrational, considering how he was living his daily life. But that brought him back to Westfield. And at this stage in his addiction, he's no longer allowed to stay in our home. So he's basically homeless, hopping from place to place, crashing wherever he can, doing drugs with whoever he can find. All of his belongings fit into a backpack. He just kept starting over. He would have it all and lose it all, or sell it all. His only concern was getting his next fix. He became desperate again and once again paid a visit to his grandmother, sold several checks, forged them, cashed them for several $100s. And once again, he returns to Tioga County Prison, facing more felony charges. I truly believed my son was going to go to state prison this time. I can't tell you how many tears I shed thinking about my little boy in state prison. But after many months in jail, the charges were pled down, he was given time served, and more fines were piled on, but he did return again to Westfield. This time, his family pitched together and got him a truck so that he could find a job. This was a very frustrating process because he didn't really have a strong work ethic. He had no real work history, but he eventually found a pizza delivery job, and he was 2 weeks employed when one morning he decided to drive himself to the local ER and use his Crohn's disease to get it fixed. This was a pretty common thing he did. He was able to con the doctors with his disease. They took him seriously, and his acting skills were finally tuned in for this. On this particular occasion, the nurse told him he would need a driver to get him home. He was still under the influence. But he really didn't want his family to know he was up to the same old tricks, so he certainly wasn't going to call us to come and get him. He ignored her warning and hopped in his truck and drove away. He was picked up 1 block from the hospital by the local police and taken back to Tioga County Prison for driving under the influence. His truck was towed away and put in storage. He was in jail for months that time. By the time he got out, the storage fees were so ridiculously high on his vehicle that he lost his truck. Once again, Jake's out of jail, and this time he seemed really determined to get things straight, get it right. He landed a full-time job that he loved, and he was actually very good at it. Ironically, it was a phone sales job. He was getting regular paychecks and bonuses on top of that. We were all proud of him. He was proud of himself, and I really hoped that that new confidence he was gaining would deter him from his addiction. But I eventually realized he was not paying his bills, even though he was constantly broke. And then I found a dirty spoon and some other paraphernalia at his place one day. I left a desperate message with his PO to call me immediately, and he must have sensed the urgency in my voice and knew that Jake was in trouble, because a few days later, he knocked on Jake's door and drug tested him, and obviously Jake tested positive and was once again taken back to jail for violation of probation. So you can see that one of the recurring themes in our story is jail. And as a parent, it's really hard for me to admit to you all how selfishly relieved I felt during those times my son was incarcerated. Because I knew he wasn't using, I knew he had food and shelter, and I knew he was getting some counseling in jail. I could visit him twice a week for 20 minutes per visit. There was no personal contact, no hello hug or kiss on the cheek goodbye, but I knew he was relatively safe. And I wasn't waiting for that dreaded call from the ER that my son had overdosed, or worse yet, a call from the coroner's office. Some events still seem surreal, even 6 years into his addiction. No parent should ever have to hear their child say, "I had a gun held to my head yesterday," or take a call from him in the middle of the night, him hysterically telling me that one of his friends had just OD'd and died beside him in the backseat of a car. Or nonchalantly say, "It's okay, Mom, it's happened before," after I had just witnessed him have a drug-related seizure. So how is Jake doing today? Well, after his last jail term, which was close to 2 years ago, he decided to go into a 14-month Christian-based program. He promised us he would graduate from the program, and we made promises to him based on that. But after 13 months, he left the program and decided to go back to York and live in a sober house. And in a few short months, he went from a sober house to a halfway house to now living with a girlfriend and her father in Lancaster. He did come home and spent Thanksgiving and Christmas with us this year, which was the first time he spent those holidays with us in about 4 or 5 years. There were actually many years when we had purchased Christmas gifts for him and actually returned them because he was so deep into his addiction, or he was in rehab or in jail. We just returned the gifts. So it was nice having him home. And I can only pray that he's doing as well as I think he is doing, or hope that he's doing. But he's made some choices that have forever consequences. He continues to battle his addiction. He's on probation in 2 counties with multiple fines to pay. And he constantly fears arrest when he falls behind on his payments on those fines. His driver's license was revoked by PennDOT when he pled guilty to a drug charge. He has difficulty finding a decent job due to his conviction record. And by now he's been blacklisted by many doctors and hospitals because he's an addict. That's a pretty dangerous thing for someone with his chronic lifelong disease. And he's lost the complete trust of his family. And trust is the hardest part for me because I love my son with all my heart. And I really, really try to be supportive. But when he calls asking for money, I still wonder if it's my son Jake calling because he's having a hard time paying the bill or needs some extra money for groceries because he's making minimum wage. Or is it addict Jake who needs money to buy some heroin and shoot it into his arm? There are times when he calls and he just sounds happy and maybe a little too silly, and I wonder, is this my son Jake who's clean and really enjoying life finally? Or is this addict Jake who's high and thinks I won't notice? These are questions we'll ask every day for the rest of our lives because every day Jake has to wake up and make the decision to stay clean or give in to the temptation and use. And I can tell you after sharing all of this with you that I still consider myself one of the lucky moms. Because even though our relationship is strained at times, I still have my son. Please remember, addiction is a forever disease with forever consequences. It does not discriminate and it can happen to you. Walk away.